Hey everyone, if you've been watching gas prices jump, shipping fees spike, gold twitch like it's listening to bad news, and the dollar suddenly feel too strong one week and too shaky the next, this isn't random noise. There's a point in wars where the battlefield and your daily costs start moving on the same track, whether you care about geopolitics or not, and the uncomfortable question isn't who's winning today. The real question is whether this war is getting locked into a direction that becomes harder and harder to stop. Keep watching and I'll give you 7 signs that the point of no return is getting close, so you can read headlines without getting yanked around by clickbait panic, because the worst part is simple. After a certain threshold, nobody can U-turn cleanly anymore. Most people hear point of no return and imagine something cinematic. A single dramatic moment, a button press, a bridge blown, but in real life it's usually boring at first. It looks like paperwork, budgets, policy tweaks, and temporary decisions that quietly become permanent. The simplest definition is this: it's the point where the cost of stopping becomes bigger than the cost of continuing. Not because leaders want to keep going, but because previous choices have already built a trap, and the trap isn't made of one thing. It's made of commitments that stack on top of each other until the exit is too narrow to use. Think about it in everyday terms. If you're halfway through moving apartments and the old lease is over tomorrow, stopping isn't just changing your mind. You'd have to put your whole life back into boxes, find storage, eat penalties, rebook trucks, maybe lose your deposit. The decision stops being emotional and becomes mechanical. Wars do that too, not all at once, but step by step, like a ratchet that only clicks forward, and people miss it because the ratchet doesn't look like a cliff. It looks like a series of small fine for now choices. Here's the pivot most people don't make. They think peace is a switch, but peace is a price tag, and that price tag rises over time. At the start of a conflict, leaders have flexibility. They can bargain, pause, trade concessions, save face, reshuffle. Later on, every option comes with a public cost, a financial cost, and a credibility cost. You can almost feel the menu shrinking. The choices don't disappear overnight, they just get uglier, and once the choices are ugly enough, continuing starts to feel like the least bad option, even if it's still bad. So why don't most people notice when that threshold is getting close? Because we're trained to watch the wrong signals. We watch speeches, summits, big statements like we're open to talks. We look for a handshake photo and think the story is over, but behind the photo, systems are being reconfigured. Money moves, factories retool, recruitment pipelines change, laws tighten, supply chains reroute. Those changes are the real story because they don't care what anyone says on a podium. They keep operating even when the rhetoric shifts. There's a common misunderstanding that makes everything sound easier than it is. If both sides are tired, they'll negotiate. That's what people say when they want the world to behave like a group project, but wars are closer to a business model than a mood. Once an economy, a political narrative, and a logistics network start depending on the war, stopping isn't just ending violence, it's rewiring the entire machine, and machines don't like sudden rewires. They spark, they break, they take leaders down with them. Let me make this super clear without getting preachy. I'm not predicting a specific outcome, and I'm not saying anyone should panic by anything. I'm explaining the mechanism so you can spot it. That's it. The point is to recognize when the exit is narrowing, not to guess which date it closes. Quick educational note, because I'd rather you stay grounded than get swept up. Verify claims with primary sources, avoid sharing unverified rumors, and remember laws still apply during crises, especially around money movement and online behavior. Now, when people say this war could end with one negotiation, they're assuming the war is still in a phase where decisions are reversible, but wars get locked by 4 kinds of locks that don't look like locks at first. One is financial, one is human, one is political storytelling, and one is infrastructure and supply chains. You don't have to memorize those categories, just notice the pattern. Each lock makes the next lock easier to click into place, and the longer it goes, the more the locks start feeding each other. The financial lock is the one people argue about endlessly, usually in the shallowest way possible. They have energy revenue, so they can fight forever, or on the other side, sanctions will end it any day now. Both takes can be lazy because they treat money like a pile of cash under a mattress, but a modern state's war spending isn't just having money, it's a whole ecosystem: contracts, factories, wages, supply chains, budgets, and political promises tied to that spending. Once an economy shifts into a war footing, stopping can trigger its own crisis, and that's the part that freaks leaders out, because here's the twist: the war doesn't only burn resources, it also becomes a source of jobs, production quotas, and political control. Factories ramp up, certain industries get priority, private companies get pulled closer to the state, capital controls tighten temporarily, budgets get rebalanced, and when you try to reverse that, you don't just save money, you create layoffs, you break contracts, you upset the groups that suddenly depend on the war economy. The war starts acting like gravity. It keeps pulling decisions toward itself. This is where your daily life connects, even if you never look at a map. When war spending becomes the center of the system starts pushing costs outward. Energy markets get jumpy. Shipping gets more expensive, sometimes because routes change, sometimes because risk premiums change, sometimes because insurance changes. Currency stress shows up in strange ways. One month it's inflation fear, the next month it's safe haven hoarding. Gold and oil can move like they're reacting to the same heartbeat. You feel it in fuel, groceries, imported goods, and anything that relies on long supply chains. It's not the war is far away, the war is in the pricing model. And here's the part people don't want to hear. Leaders can't just stop when the system is already reorganized around continuing. They can want peace sincerely and still be trapped by the costs of peace. That doesn't mean peace is impossible. It means peace gets more expensive. Every month the war runs, the stopping bill grows. Interest like a loan you didn't realize you signed. You can almost see how this becomes self-reinforcing. The longer the war lasts, the more resources are committed. The more resources committed, the more stopping feels like admitting waste. The more stopping feels like admitting waste, the more leaders frame it as existential. And once it's framed as existential, compromise becomes politically radioactive. The war stops being a policy choice and starts becoming a survival story. Pause on that for a second, because that survival story is where the next lock clicks, not the missiles, not the tanks, not even the front line. It's the moment the war becomes the thing the leadership can't afford to explain away, and once that happens, the exit doesn't just narrow, it tilts. Once the exit tilts, money is the first thing that stops behaving like money. It turns into a system that has to keep moving because too many people are standing underneath it. At the beginning of a war, spending looks like an expense line you can cut. Later, it starts looking like a payroll, an industrial plan, and a political promise all welded together. You can almost hear it in the language: temporary measures, emergency budgets, special allocations. Then a few months pass, and those temporary measures become the baseline. That is when stopping doesn't feel like saving, it feels like pulling the plug on your own economy. The mistake is thinking war spending is just cash leaving the building. A modern war economy rewires factories, labor, procurement, shipping lanes, and credit. Ammunition orders are multi-year, repairs become constant, subcontractors pop up like mushrooms. If the government becomes the biggest buyer in the room, whole industries stop caring about consumers and start caring about state contracts, and once that dependence forms, ending the war isn't just a diplomatic act. It's an industrial shock. Leaders know it, even when they won't say it out loud, because they've seen what sudden demobilization can do to a society that is already strained. This is why the energy argument is always oversimplified. Yes, revenue matters. But what matters more is whether the state has built a machine that can survive without the war-shaped cash flow. When a country shifts deeper into war footing, it often tightens control over what it calls strategic sectors, pushes production priorities, and squeezes anything that looks like luxury or dissent. At first, it's subtle: more regulation, more oversight, more patriotic messaging. Later, it gets blunt: capital controls, forced conversions, quiet pressure on companies to align, and rules that make it harder to move money or people freely. You don't have to be an economist to spot it. Just watch how quickly market logic gets replaced by national necessity. And the reason it reaches your pocket so fast is because markets don't wait for official announcements. If traders believe war is becoming structurally permanent, they price risk into everything: tankers, shipping insurance, freight rates, grain futures, fertilizer, industrial metals. Anything that depends on predictable routes and stable payments starts carrying a risk premium. Then you feel it in everyday places that never mention geopolitics. Delivery costs creep up, imported goods fluctuate, airlines adjust. Manufacturers pass on uncertainty as temporary surcharges that somehow never disappear. It's not a moral story, it's math, and math doesn't care if a politician gives a hopeful speech at 2 a.m. So what do you look for if you want to know whether the money side is locking in? Watch for persistence, not headlines. If defense budgets rise once, that's news. If they rise and stay high even when there's political pressure to cut, that's a signal. If industrial production is increasingly prioritized around military needs, that's another. If the state starts talking about economic sovereignty in ways that justify intervention, that's another, and if private business starts behaving like it's operating in a semi-command economy waiting for instructions, aligning with national messaging, treating government contracts like oxygen, then the machine is hardening. At that point, leaders are not just funding a war, they're building an ecosystem that panics at the idea of peace. Now, money is powerful, but it's not the strongest gravity. The strongest gravity is people. That's the second lock, and it's darker, because it turns human beings into numbers while still needing them to be loyal. Early in a conflict, leaders can pretend manpower is infinite. They talk like it's a resource that can be replenished on command, but prolonged war isn't just how many people exist. It's whether you can keep feeding the front without breaking the society behind it. The moment losses, fatigue, and resentment outpace replacement, you get a pressure cooker, and pressure cookers don't release steam politely. Here's what people miss. Manpower isn't only about soldiers, it's about the entire labor force. Factories need workers, rail networks need operators, farms need hands, hospitals need staff. If the state pulls too much of the working-age population into uniform or even into supporting roles, everything else starts cracking. And that's when leaders face a brutal choice they don't want to admit exists. Either they escalate recruitment in ways that make the war harder to reverse, or they try to freeze the conflict in place because their replacement pipeline is sputtering. Both paths shrink the exit. One shrinks it by force, the other shrinks it by cement. You can see the manpower lock forming through policy signals long before you see it on the battlefield. If recruitment shifts from voluntary pride to financial desperation, pay attention. If bonuses rise sharply, if eligibility rules widen, if older age brackets get pulled in, if exemptions quietly disappear, that's a system trying to refill a leaking bucket. If the state increases pressure on emigration, harder to leave, harder to avoid service, harsher penalties for evasion, that's the lock clicking. And if the messaging turns from "we're winning" to "we must endure," that's another tell. Winning is a celebration, endurance is a warning. This is also where the conflict starts generating incentives for riskier decisions. If manpower becomes tight, leaders are tempted to substitute people with firepower and firepower with escalation. More drones, more missiles, more strikes on infrastructure. The logic becomes cold. If you can't keep sending bodies, you try to break the enemy's system instead. That's when the war stops being only about territory and starts being about throughput: energy grids, transport nodes, supply depots, factories, ports. And once that style of war becomes normal, stopping isn't just ceasefire, it's agreeing to stop hitting the levers you've trained yourself to pull. For regular people watching from the outside, manpower stress shows up indirectly but fast. When a society is under manpower strain, it gets more brittle. Crime patterns shift, information controls tighten, social trust erodes, cyber activity often spikes because it is cheaper than conventional operations and it keeps pressure on adversaries without burning troops. Cross-border business becomes harder because compliance risk rises, transactions get scrutinized, and governments start treating trade like a weapon. If you're wondering why online spaces feel more polarized, why scams surge during global instability, why certain platforms suddenly feel hotter, it's because societies under stress become easier to manipulate. And manipulated societies make worse decisions, which feeds the cycle. Now zoom out and connect the two locks. War footing spending needs workers and political quiet. Manpower strain creates political noise and economic disruption. So the state tries to manage both with control: more control over money, more control over people. That's when normal politics starts to fade. You get more laws designed for emergency permanence, more pressure on media, more punishment for dissent framed as harmful to unity. And to be clear, this isn't unique to one country or one ideology. It's what systems do when they feel threatened. They tighten, they centralize, they demand a single story, which brings us to the most dangerous lock of all, because it doesn't live in factories or barracks. It lives in the narrative the story leaders tell their people and the story they tell themselves. Once a war becomes a test of identity, retreat isn't a policy change, it's humiliation, it's betrayal, it's we didn't just lose land, we lost meaning. And when meaning is on the line, rational exits start sounding like surrender. You can negotiate borders, you can negotiate sanctions, but negotiating pride, that's where things get ugly. Watch for the moment the language hardens into something that can't be walked back, not just slogans but commitments that are written into law, drilled into school curricula, baked into state media, and repeated until they become social gravity. That's when the war stops needing constant justification. Because the justification becomes automatic, people start policing each other. Silence becomes suspicious, nuance becomes dangerous. And the really chilling part is this: even if leaders privately want an off-ramp, they may no longer control the monster they created. The story starts controlling them, because when the story is locked, a ceasefire isn't just ink on paper, it's a threat to the regime's legitimacy, and once legitimacy is threatened, the incentives flip. Suddenly, continuing the war can feel safer than ending it, safer for the leadership, safer for the system, safer for the people who have tied their careers to the war. That's when negotiations become theater. That's when conditions become impossible. That's when diplomacy turns into a waiting room where nobody wants to be the first person to blink, and right there in that waiting room is where the point of no return stops being a theory and starts behaving like a trapdoor, because the next lock doesn't announce itself, it just quietly changes what the state is allowed to say, what the public is allowed to believe, and what peace is allowed to mean. Once the story is locked, everything else gets easier to justify. Leaders stop talking about options and start talking about destiny, because destiny can't be negotiated. The goalposts harden, the language turns absolute, and suddenly any compromise isn't a trade, it's betrayal. That's when a ceasefire becomes dangerous internally, because it forces the system to explain why all the sacrifice was for nothing, and if the system can't explain it, the system risks cracking. So the war keeps going, not because it's rational, but because backing down becomes politically lethal. You'll notice it when the messaging stops being about strategy and starts being about identity. When objectives get written into law, when dissent gets treated like sabotage, when media control tightens, the exit isn't just narrow, it's booby-trapped. Even leaders who privately want an off-ramp can get pinned by their own audience, their own elites, or their own security services. The war becomes a loyalty test, and loyalty tests don't end with handshakes, they end when someone runs out of leverage or runs out of time, and the scary part is that at this stage, peace talks can happen and still mean nothing, because the real decision is no longer on the table. Then it gets worse, because a locked narrative looks outward too. If you can't admit weakness at home, you can't look flexible abroad. That's when diplomacy shifts from let us find terms to meet conditions you can possibly accept. It's not negotiation. It's performance, designed to prove the other side is the obstacle, and while that performance plays out, everyday risks climb, cyber pressure ramps up, trade gets politicized, cross-border payments get harder, and businesses start treating ordinary transactions like potential liabilities. You feel it as friction, delays, compliance checks, sudden restrictions, little pieces of sand in the gears. The public sees speeches, but markets feel the sand. Now we hit the lock that moves fastest into your daily costs, because its physical infrastructure and supply chains don't care about talking points. When routes change, they stay changed, because companies invest around the new reality. When energy flows get rerouted, they create new dependencies and new choke points. When a country builds shadow logistics to move goods under restrictions, that network becomes a parallel economy, less efficient, more expensive, and harder to turn off without pain. And once those parallel routes exist, they don't disappear when the mood improves, they disappear when it stops being profitable, or when enforcement finally makes it too risky. This is where you see weird phrases pop up in serious reports, things like tightened enforcement, maritime advisories, and shadow fleets. It's not just about oil. It's about the entire hidden plumbing that keeps money moving when official pipes are blocked. When authorities start targeting those networks more aggressively, it doesn't just hurt a government's revenue, it adds cost to every shipment, every insurance policy, every intermediary, every workaround, and cost doesn't vanish. It gets passed down the chain until it lands on someone who doesn't even know what a price cap coalition is. That someone is usually the consumer, staring at a receipt, wondering why the world is suddenly more expensive, and infrastructure isn't only about exports. It's also about what gets hit, what gets repaired, and what can't be repaired quickly enough. When energy grids and transport nodes are attacked in repeated waves, you don't just lose electrons and concrete, you lose predictability. Businesses can't plan, warehouses can't schedule, manufacturers can't guarantee delivery, shipping risk. Premiums jump because nobody wants to be the next headline, and if the Black Sea becomes riskier on a given week, freight costs don't politely stay local. They ripple into grain, fuel, and everything that uses long-haul logistics. That's the point where far away starts showing up in the most boring place possible, the cost of moving stuff. So when people ask what's the bad part, it's not one apocalypse scenario, it's 3 different kinds of ugly, and each one bleeds into price instability in its own way. One is the frozen war, not peace, not full escalation. just an open wound that keeps reopening every few months. That kind of war doesn't shock you once. It taxes you continuously: energy volatility, periodic inflation bursts, and constant uncertainty that drags growth down. Another is the step-by-step escalation, where the most dangerous variable isn't intent, it's misunderstanding: one strike misread, one incident spun, one retaliation that goes too far, and the third is spillover. You don't need a new front line for that, you just need one critical link: shipping, payments, undersea cables, cyber systems too. Get hit hard enough that whole regions feel it. I'm not telling you which one will happen, because nobody gets that privilege. I'm telling you why the locks make all three more likely over time, and why the door back to normal keeps narrowing. If you're making financial moves off this, stick to licensed advisors, follow local tax and reporting rules, and never treat viral clips as investment signals. The goal here is clarity, not adrenaline, and clarity starts by watching the signs that the system is hardening, because systems harden quietly until they don't. When the hardening is advanced enough, the next shift can feel sudden, even if it was built slowly. So let's make this practical. One sign is when war spending stays high and starts crowding everything else out, year after year, even when the economy is strained. Another is when recruitment rules change in ways that don't easily reverse: expanded eligibility, stronger penalties, tighter control on who can leave. Another is when information space gets squeezed harder: more censorship, more criminalization of disagreement, more unity language that treats doubt as treason. Another is when trade routes and energy routes get structurally rerouted: new hubs, new intermediaries, new dependence on middlemen, because once companies invest in the detour becomes the highway. If you see those four together, you're not watching a temporary crisis anymore. You're watching a system choose permanence. Then look for the signs that move fastest into your cost of living. Repeated strikes on infrastructure, especially energy and transport, are a direct pipeline to instability. Diplomacy that shifts into impossible terms is another, because it signals the narrative has become more important than outcomes. And finally, watch the market mood swings: the risk-on, risk-off behavior, where oil, gold, and the dollar whip around harder and more often on the same kinds of headlines. None of these signs alone means point of no return. But when several appear at the same time, the exit isn't just narrow, it's getting blocked by decisions that are expensive to undo. If you remember one thing, make it this: the point of no return isn't a movie moment where the camera zooms in and the soundtrack hits. It's a chain of choices that quietly removes graceful options until only ugly options remain. And when only ugly options remain, leaders don't suddenly become wise. They become defensive. That's when instability stops being a phase and starts being the environment. If this helped you see the war through the lens of systems instead of headlines, drop a comment with the one sign you think is most visible right now: money, manpower, narrative, or infrastructure, and why. And if you want more breakdowns that connect geopolitics to real-world risk without the panic, you know what to do with the subscribe button.